She arrived in Blackstone Hollow with a suitcase, a father who wouldn't meet her eyes, and 3 days before the mountain pass closed for winter. By sunset of the second day, her father had already signed her name next to a stranger's. No asking, no warning, just a quiet conversation between two men while she was hanging laundry, and when she came back inside, her future had already been decided. The man's name was Silas Boone. He was 31 years old, lived alone at the edge of the tree line, and hadn't spoken more than 20 words to her in her life. If you're watching this story unfold, stay with us until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon that carried Abigail Mercer into Blackstone Hollow smelled like wet canvas and horse sweat, and the road into the valley was nothing but frozen ruts and mud that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. She sat in the back with her trunk wedged between her knees, watching the mountains rise on either side until the sky shrank to a thin gray ribbon above the pine ridges. Her father, Edmund, sat up front with the driver and didn't look back once. She was 20 years old. She had left everything she knew in Carthage, Missouri. Her mother's grave, 2 friends she'd probably never write to, a schoolroom she'd taught in for a year and a half, and she had done it because Edmund asked her to, because he said the valley had promise, because he said it was a fresh start. What he hadn't said, not in the weeks of packing and the 4 days of travel, was that he'd already been writing letters to a man named Silas Boone. Blackstone Hollow wasn't much to look at when they rolled in. A scattering of cabins along a creek that ran brown with snowmelt, a general store with a porch that sagged on one side, a smithy that belched gray smoke into the cold afternoon. Maybe 40 people total, spread across the valley floor and up into the tree line where the better sheltered Homestead sat. It was the kind of place that had been forgotten by maps on purpose. Edmund climbed down from the wagon before it fully stopped and shook hands with a man waiting near the store. Abigail watched from the wagon bed, her fingers tight around the handle of her trunk. The man was tall, broader through the shoulders than she expected, wearing a coat that had been mended so many times the patches had patches. Dark hair. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week. He didn't smile when Edmund pumped his hand, didn't do much of anything except nod once and glance toward the wagon. That was the first time she and Silas Boone looked at each other. She looked away first. Jen, Edmund told her that night, in the one-room shack he'd arranged to rent from the storekeeper. He sat across the table from her with his hands folded and his eyes somewhere around the middle of the table, and he talked about the pass. "It closes in 10 days, he said. Maybe less if the weather turns. Once it closes, nobody gets in or out until March." "I know that," Abigail said. You told me before we left Carthage. I need you to understand what that means for a young woman without a husband in a place like this." She went very still. "What are you saying, Papa?" Edmund was not a cruel man. She had always known that. He was a man who loved her in the way that certain fathers loved their daughters, completely and without the ability to show it well. He looked at problems and solved them the way he'd fix a broken fence rail. And he had looked at Abigail's situation and seen something that needed fixing. "Silas Boone is a good man," he said. "I've been corresponding with him since August. He knows this valley. He knows how to survive here. He's got a solid cabin, enough stores laid in for 2 winters, and he's got, Papa, a reputation for being honest. Not a drinker. Not a... Papa." Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was worse, somehow, than if she'd yelled. "Are you telling me you've arranged a marriage?" Edmund's hands tightened against each other. "I'm telling you that you have a safe option." "That is not the same thing as what I asked." He finally looked up. There was something in his face she didn't have a name for. Not quite guilt, not quite certainty. Something in between that she found harder to look at than either one would have been. "The papers are drawn up," he said. Silas agreed it would happen before the pass closes. Abigail sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the wind was already talking through the gaps in the cabin walls. She could hear it testing the place, looking for weaknesses. She thought about the pass closing, about being stranded in this valley through a full mountain winter with no standing, no claim, no protection, except her father's reputation and whatever goodwill a stranger might extend to a young woman alone. She thought about all of that, and she still felt the thing harden in her chest like water turning to ice. "You should have asked me," she said. I know it. You should have written to me about it, given me time to think. I know it, Abigail. But you didn't. Edmund didn't answer that. There wasn't much he could say to it that would have mattered. She went to bed on the rope cot in the corner and stared at the dark ceiling until sometime past midnight, and she made herself a promise. She would do what needed doing. She would survive the winter. But she would not give this valley, or this arrangement, or this man she'd never spoken to. She would not give any of it one more thing than absolutely necessary. She met properly with Silas the following morning, at the store, with Edmund and the storekeeper, a broad woman named Ruth Halsey, present as witnesses. Ruth had a face like worn leather and eyes that missed nothing, and she watched the whole proceeding with an expression Abigail couldn't read. The arrangement was simple enough. Silas's cabin was a mile and a half up the creek, backed against a granite shelf that broke the worst of the north wind. He had 2 rooms, a root cellar, a small barn with a mule and 3 goats. He trapped beaver and mink along the creek tributaries in winter, traded the pelts in spring, and had enough put back to see them through until March without hardship. He explained all of this in a flat, even voice, looking mostly at the middle distance rather than directly at her, as if he was reciting information she needed rather than trying to impress her with it. He didn't embellish, he didn't sell himself. When he finished, he said, "I don't expect anything from you that you're not willing to give. I want that said plain." "That's very gracious," Abigail said, and heard how it came out, clipped and cold, and didn't try to soften it. Silas looked at her then, straight on, for the first time. His eyes were a dark gray-brown, the color of creek water after rain. He didn't flinch from the tone of her voice, and he didn't apologize for his own position, and he didn't look away. "It's not gracious," he said. "It's just how it is." She signed the paper. She didn't feel anything when she did it, except a dull pressure behind her sternum, like something being compressed that hadn't been given enough room. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took place 2 days later in Ruth Halsey's store, which doubled as the closest thing the hollow had to a community hall. Ruth said the words herself, having some kind of informal authority that Abigail didn't fully understand yet. There were perhaps a dozen people present, neighbors from up and down the creek, a few trappers Edmund had gotten acquainted with, a couple of children who had wandered in and stayed for the warmth. Abigail wore her second-best dress because her best dress was packed at the bottom of her trunk, and she didn't feel like unpacking her trunk to get it out. Silas wore the same coat she'd seen him in the first day, which had clearly been brushed and the worst of the mud knocked off it. He stood straight. He said the words when he was supposed to. His hands, when they briefly touched hers for the ring, a plain band of copper, no pretense, were steady. Hers were not. Afterward, people shook hands and said the usual things, and Ruth Halsey pressed a jar of apple preserves into Abigail's arms with a look that seemed to carry some kind of message Abigail didn't have enough context yet to decode. Edmund hugged her too long and said, "You'll be all right," too many times, which was something men said when they needed convincing of a thing themselves. And then Silas brought the mule around with her trunk lashed to it, and they walked the mile and a half up the creek to his cabin without talking much, because there wasn't much to say. The cabin surprised her. She had built up a picture of it in her mind based on nothing except what she knew about solitary men who lived alone in mountain valleys. And the picture was grim, dark, close, smelling of unwashed wool and old smoke and whatever men accumulated when nobody was watching. She had prepared herself for it the way you prepare for unpleasant medicine. Just get through it, don't make a face. The cabin was none of that. It was one main room with a separate sleeping room built as an addition off the back, connected through a low door frame. Small, yes. Simple, certainly. But clean in the way that spoke of habit rather than effort. The kind of clean that happened because someone simply didn't leave a mess, rather than because someone cleaned up messes after the fact. There were pegs along one wall for coats and gear, all of them occupied but neatly so. A table with 2 chairs. A shelf of supplies arranged by type and size. A cast iron stove that was throwing good heat, which meant Silas had come ahead of her at some point to get it going. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it all, and Silas set her trunk down near the door to the back room. "The bedroom is yours," he said. "I'll sleep out here." She turned to look at him. "That's your bed." "I've slept by a stove before." He said it simply, without drama, in the same flat voice he used for everything else. "I'm not going to put you out of—" "Abigail." He said her name for the first time and it stopped her. It's fine, take the room. Get settled. There's food in the pot when you're ready. She looked at him for a moment. This man who was technically her husband, who had slept alone in this cabin for however many years, who was now proposing to give up his bed to a woman who had barely looked at him and certainly hadn't been warm to him, and she didn't know what to do with any of it. Thank you, she said finally, because there wasn't anything else that fit. He nodded once and went to check on something at the stove, and she took her trunk into the back room and closed the low door behind her. The room was small, a bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar and clean air, a window with oiled paper in the frame that let in gray light, a wooden peg on the wall with nothing hanging from it. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and took a slow breath. She had been married for 4 hours. She was in a stranger's home in a valley that would trap her here until March. Her father was 1.5 miles away in a rented shack that wasn't much warmer than being outside. She would handle it. She would get through the winter and figure out what came next. She would not cry, and she would not fall apart, and she would not, under any circumstances, depend on the goodwill of a man she didn't know. She unpacked her trunk. The first week was an exercise in careful navigation. Silas was up before dawn every morning, moving quietly so as not to wake her, and was usually gone to the trap lines by the time she had the breakfast fire going. He came back by mid-morning most days, sometimes with pelts, sometimes empty-handed, always looking like the cold had tried to take something from him and failed. He didn't ask her to cook for him, but he ate whatever was on the table without complaint, and he did the dishes after without being asked, which was the kind of small thing that Abigail noticed without wanting to. She found her footing slowly. The cabin had a rhythm she had to learn. When the stove needed banking, when the water bucket needed filling from the creek before it froze over each morning, which of the 3 goats was prone to kicking. She learned by watching and by making mistakes, and Silas never once pointed out a mistake. She discovered he'd been keeping a better stocked larder than most of the valley people knew about. Smoked venison, dried beans, cornmeal, jarred preserves. They weren't going to go hungry. She had not expected that. By the end of the first week, they had developed something like a functional silence between them. Not hostile, but not warm either. They shared the table for meals and occasionally exchanged practical information about the day, and sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't classify. And when she looked at him, he simply looked away, not embarrassed, just redirecting. She told herself she didn't care what he was thinking. She was not entirely convincing. The first real conversation happened on a Thursday in the second week, and it started because of a mouse. She was at the shelf, taking stock of the preserves, 3 jars of apple, 2 of something she thought might be plum, a crock of rendered fat, when she heard a scrabbling sound behind the flour sack, and then a small brown shape shot across the shelf and vanished into the gap between the shelf and the wall. She made a sound, not quite a scream, more like a sharp syllable that didn't become anything. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. He looked at her. He looked at the shelf. "Mouse?" he said. "Yes." She felt heat in her face, which she resented. "They startle me. I'm not frightened of them." "I know." The sound just... "You don't have to explain," he said, and went back to the harness. She turned back to the shelf and recounted the jars, and found that she had lost her place and had to start over. After a moment, she said, "Do you have a trap for them?" "Several. I'll set them tonight." He paused, pulling a strap through its buckle. "I get lazy about it in autumn. By the time it's cold enough for mice to want in, I've usually got other things on my mind." "What kind of things?" He seemed mildly surprised that she'd followed up. "Getting the woodpile sorted, making sure the roof's got no soft spots before the snow loads up on it, checking the barn twice a day to see the goats aren't going to freeze." "You do all of that yourself?" "Been doing it myself for 6 years." She looked at him, at the methodical way he was working the harness leather, the unhurried attention he gave it. "Did you ever want help?" she asked. "I mean, did you ever not want to do it alone?" The question came out more direct than she'd intended, and she saw him still for a second before he continued working. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't just answer. "Some things are easier alone," he said finally, "and some things... you do them alone because there isn't another option, and eventually you stop knowing the difference." She didn't say anything to that. After a moment he added, without looking up, "There's a difference. I just got used to not thinking about it. She went back to counting jars. She thought about what he'd said for the rest of the afternoon, and she didn't entirely want to. October deepened and the temperature dropped with it, and Abigail began to understand the valley's rhythms in a more immediate way. The mornings were bitter now, the creek growing a thin skim of ice at the edges by dawn, and the light had that low winter slant that made everything look both beautiful and dangerous at the same time. She started going with Silas when he checked the closer trap lines, mostly because the cabin felt smaller when he wasn't in it, and the solitude had started to press on her in ways she didn't want to examine. He didn't seem to mind. He showed her how to move quietly in the woods, how to read the creek for places where animals came to drink, how to tell from the snow whether the tracks were fresh. She learned things about him, out there in the trees. He was patient in a way she hadn't seen in many men. Not passive, not resigned, but genuinely unruffled, the kind of person who could wait for something without burning with impatience while waiting. He made decisions quickly when he needed to and didn't second-guess them after. And he was funny, occasionally, in a dry way that caught her off guard. A single flat sentence that was either an observation or a joke, and she couldn't always tell which until she thought about it for a second. "That one got loose," he said one morning, looking at a trap that had been sprung but was empty. "How?" "Smart," he said, like that explained everything, and then he reset the trap and moved on. She laughed before she meant to. He glanced at her and something shifted briefly in his face. Not quite a smile, but close to the foundations of one. She stopped laughing, not because she wanted to, but because she wasn't ready to give him that yet. The warmth was there, wanting to happen, and she held it back with both hands. The valley's social life, such as it was, centered around Ruth Halsey's store on Saturday afternoons when people came for supplies and stayed for the news and company. Abigail went with Silas the second week of October and met most of the Hollows people properly for the first time. There were the Pittman brothers, Cale and Duff, who had a homestead up the east branch of the creek and were the kind of men who were decent enough individually and exhausting in combination. There was a widow named Marta Svensson who had come out from Minnesota with her husband 5 years ago and was still here after he died, tending a small farm with the kind of stubborn efficiency that Abigail recognized and respected. There were the Greer family, husband, wife, 4 children, who lived nearest to the pass and always had news from whatever travelers had come through before the closing. And there was Fletcher Ames. She noticed him the way you notice a room that's a slightly wrong temperature. Not immediately wrong, but often a way that made her pay attention. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, well-dressed by valley standards, with a manner that was polished in a way that felt applied, like a coat of paint over something she couldn't identify. He ran a small trading post on the south end of the valley and had his fingers in most of the commerce that moved through Blackstone Hollow. He shook her hand and said all the right things about welcoming her to the valley, and he and Silas nodded at each other with the specific kind of cordiality that meant they didn't especially like each other, but had decided to be civil about it. Later, walking back up the creek in the fading afternoon light, she asked Silas about him. "Fletcher Ames," Silas said. "Been here about 4 years. Does well." "You don't like him." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He's the kind of man who knows how to be liked," he said finally. "Knows it the way you'd know a skill. He works at it." "That's not necessarily a bad thing." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not necessarily anything." She thought about that, the distinction he was drawing. A man who was genuinely what he appeared to be versus a man who had learned to appear. It was a fine line, and she noticed that Silas had not crossed it into accusation. She noticed that he was careful with his words in that way, and she filed it away. November came in hard. The first real snow fell on the 3rd of the month, 6 inches overnight, and when Abigail woke to it, she felt for the first time the full weight of what the mountain pass closing actually meant. She stood at the door and looked out at the white-buried world and understood, in her bones rather than just her head, that there was no leaving now. Whatever happened in this valley would happen, and the mountains would hold them all in it together. She was surprised to find that the feeling wasn't as bad as she'd expected. The cabin was warm. The woodpile was enormous. She had watched Silas add to it through all of October with a diligence that had struck her at the time as bordering on excessive, and now she understood it wasn't excessive at all. The stores were full. The goats were snug. She had her books, her sewing, her slowly developing ability to actually cook over a wood stove, which was different from a regular stove in ways nobody had warned her about. And she had Silas, across the table at mealtimes, out on the trap lines when the weather allowed, quiet in the evenings, reading or mending or sharpening blades with the focused attention he brought to everything. She was not going to say she had grown used to him. That felt like too much. But she no longer braced herself when he came through the door, and that was something. The thing that changed her, though, the thing that cracked the first real fissure in the wall she'd built, happened not in the cabin, but half a mile down the creek at her father's. She went to visit Edmund twice a week when the weather allowed, and she had been doing it long enough that she had a sense of the shack's ongoing deterioration. Edmund had noticed the gaps in the north wall and mentioned them once, and then done nothing about them, because Edmund was a man of better plans than execution. The shack was cold in ways it shouldn't have been, and she worried about him in a way she didn't fully articulate to herself, which was the Mercer family way of worrying. It was the third weeks of November, after a night of temperatures that had dropped low enough to freeze the water in the barrel inside the store, that she arrived at Edmund's shack and found him sitting in front of the stove in his coat with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, still cold, and she saw immediately that the gap in the north wall had gotten worse, and then she saw the fresh chinking. It was packed in from the outside, gray and dense, still faintly damp at the edges. Recent work, very recent work, done at some point in the past day or two. Someone had come in while Edmund was asleep or away and done what needed doing. She ran her hand along it and it was solid. Good work, professional quality work done in the dark and the cold by someone who hadn't mentioned it. "Papa," she said carefully, "who did this?" Edmund looked at the wall. "Oh, I found it that way this morning. Thought maybe it had settled somehow." He looked at her expression. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. She was thinking about Silas, who had been up before her that morning, as always, and back by mid-morning, as always, and she was thinking about how he never talked about things he'd done, never offered them up as evidence of himself, just did them and came home and sat down to whatever was on the table. "It was Silas," she said. "How do you know?" "Because nobody else would." Edmund wrapped both hands tighter around his cup and looked at the wall with a complicated expression. "Good man," he said, which was all he said, but Edmund Mercer said things once or not at all. She walked back to the cabin in the cold gray afternoon with her hands in her pockets and her jaw tight, and she felt something in her chest that she wasn't ready to give a name to. She didn't say anything to Silas about the chinking that evening. She made supper, and they ate, and he helped with the dishes, and she watched him from the corner of her eye, looking for something she could use against the feeling that was building in her. Some selfishness, some condescension, some sign that his kindnesses were strategic rather than simply himself. She didn't find it. After the dishes, he sat down with a piece of harness he'd been working on for a week, the same patient attention to detail he brought to everything, and she sat across the table with her sewing, and they were quiet together in the way they'd gotten used to, the fire making its small sounds in the stove. "Silas," she said, without planning to. He looked up. "Why did you agree to this?" She gestured vaguely, meaning the arrangement, meaning the marriage, meaning all of it. "You didn't need a wife. You've been doing fine on your own. So why?" He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding something. "Your father came to me worried," he said. "Not about the valley or the winter. About you. About me. About leaving you alone when—" He said he didn't know how much time he had. His health. He paused. He wanted to know you'd have someone. She had not known this. She felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. "He didn't tell me that." "I know. He said it was for my safety. The pass, the winter, that part was true too." Silas set down the harness. "Abigail, I didn't agree to it because I was doing your father a favor, or because I was lonely, or because I needed someone to cook." He said this simply, factually, with no particular weight on any of it. "I agreed because it seemed like the right thing to do for someone who needed it, that's all." She sat with that. "You didn't think about what it cost you," she said. Your privacy, your space." "I thought about it." "And decided it wasn't worth more than making sure you had what you needed." He picked the harness back up. "That's not a remarkable calculation, Abigail. Most people would make it." Most people don't. He didn't answer that. He went back to the harness, the needle pulling through the leather with that steady rhythm. She looked at him, this man she'd been assigned to, this man she'd prepared to resent, and she thought, I have been watching him for 6 weeks, and I cannot find the catch. I cannot find where he stops being what he appears to be. It was the most frightening thing she had discovered about him yet. She looked back at her sewing and said nothing, and the fire burned down slowly in the stove, and outside the wind had started up again, pushing against the cabin walls, testing them. They held. December's first week brought something that would mark the beginning of the hardest season Blackstone Hollow had seen in a generation. Not all at once. Winters didn't announce themselves. They arrived in increments, each one a little more than the last, like a man leaning gradually harder against a door. But there were signs for those who knew to read them, and Silas read them. He spent 3 days in early December doing things she hadn't seen him do before, reinforcing the barn, banking extra insulation around the cabin's foundation, cutting and stacking twice the wood she would have thought necessary. He checked every joint in the roof and reseeded 2 of them. He brought the goats into a smaller pen, closer to the cabin, where his body heat and theirs could pool together. She worked alongside him without being asked. She had stopped waiting to be asked. How bad? She said one afternoon, coming out of the barn with a load of hay. Bad, he said. How do you know? How the creek's running, how the animals are acting. He looked up at the sky, which was the color of old pewter, low and flat. And the last 2 winters I've been here, the bad ones started like this. She looked up at the same sky. What do we do? What we're doing. And we watch out for the neighbors. She thought about this valley, all those cabins along the creek, the Pittmans and Marta Svensson and the Greers and the dozen others. She thought about the ones who hadn't had a Silas Boone laying in stores since September. They won't all be ready, she said. No, he agreed. They won't. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Ruth's got some surplus at the store. I've been talking with her about how to manage sharing it out without it looking like charity, because half these people would rather go cold than take a handout. You've already been planning for this. For a couple weeks now. She looked at him. You didn't tell me. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been an apology if it had been allowed to develop. I should have, he said. I'm used to... He stopped. I'll do better about that. Yes, she said. You will. And something in the way she said it, not as a reprimand, but as an expectation, as a statement about how things between them were going to go from here, seemed to land with him. He looked at her with those gray-brown eyes, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. It was the first time, she thought, that she had looked at him the way you looked at someone who was yours to look at. She carried the hay into the barn and didn't let herself think about what that meant. The snow came that night. Thick, serious snow, the kind that didn't stop in the morning, the kind that meant business. The winter had arrived. The snow that fell the first week of December did not stop for 4 days. Abigail had never seen anything like it. Back in Missouri, snow came and melted and came again. A seasonal inconvenience rather than a physical force. This was different. This was the mountain deciding something, the whole weight of the sky coming down at once. And by the second morning, the world outside the cabin windows had been reduced to white in every direction. The creek disappeared. The tree line blurred. The barn, 20 feet from the cabin door, became a gray shape at the edge of visibility. Silas moved through it like a man who had expected exactly this. He went out every 4 hours. She timed it, eventually, because the regularity of it was the thing that kept her from feeling the walls close in. He'd bank the stove, pull on his coat, and the heavy wool cap she'd seen him wear only twice before, and go out to check the barn and dig out the door and make sure the woodpile was still accessible under the accumulating drift. He came back each time with snow packed into the creases of his coat and his face red from the cold. And he never said it was fine, because it wasn't exactly fine. But he also never said it was bad in a way that invited panic. She started going out with him on the second day, not because she thought he needed help, but because the alternative was standing inside counting the jars on the shelf for the 3rd time and feeling useless. You don't have to, he said when she reached for her coat. I know I don't have to. He didn't argue. He handed her the extra scarf from the peg without comment, and they went out together into the white noise of it, shoulders down, moving through drifts that came up past her knees in places. The cold was a living thing out there, something with intention, and she understood for the first time why mountain people talked about winter the way they talked about difficult personalities, as something to be managed, negotiated with, never fully trusted. The goats were agitated but whole. The mule stood at the back of its stall with a philosophical expression. The wood was still reachable if they kept digging it out, which they did. On the way back to the cabin, she stumbled in a hidden drift and went down hard on one knee, and Silas caught her arm before she went all the way over. A reflex, quick and sure, not a production. He steadied her and let go, and she got herself upright, and they kept moving without either of them saying anything about it. By the time the snow stopped on the fourth day, it sat 4 feet deep in the open spaces and deeper in the drifts. The valley had been remade. What had been a landscape of familiar shapes, the creek bend, the south pasture, the line of birch trees at the property edge, was now a white terrain that had to be relearned. Abigail stood at the cabin door on the morning of the 5th day and looked out at it and felt something she hadn't expected, a complicated kind of awe. It was brutal, and it was beautiful, and it was going to kill someone if they weren't careful, all 3 things at once, and she found she understood the valley differently for knowing that. "Ready?" Silas said from behind her. She was already reaching for her coat. They spent the morning digging out the path to the barn and then the path to the woodpile. And then, because Silas looked at the sky and said, "Not going to snow today," they walked down the creek toward the hollow's other homesteads to see what shape people were in. The answer was uneven. Marta Svensson had managed. She was a woman who had spent 5 Minnesota winters alone and had the practical intelligence of someone who had learned survival through necessity rather than instruction. Her woodpile was lower than Silas's, but sufficient. Her cabin had held. She gave them coffee, real coffee, from a supply she'd been rationing. And they sat for 20 minutes around her small table, and she and Silas talked through what the rest of the valley likely needed. "Pittman's will be short on wood," Marta said. "Cale was talking about trading for pelts instead of cutting in October. Typical." "I've got enough to spare some," Silas said. "They won't ask." "I know. I'll bring it anyway and call it a loan." Marta looked at him across the table with the expression of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by Silas Boone, but hadn't stopped noticing him. She glanced at Abigail. "You picked a useful one," she said, which was, coming from Marta, essentially a declaration of high esteem. Abigail felt heat in her face and said, "He was picked for me, actually," which she immediately regretted the tone of, because it came out with a bite she hadn't fully intended. Marta just looked at her steadily. "Most of the useful ones are," she said. "We come around eventually." They left Marta's with a list in Silas's head, not written down, just held there, the way he held most things, and worked through the afternoon checking on the Greer family and 2 other homesteads up the East Branch. The Greers were fine. Martin Greer was the kind of man who over-prepared for everything, which had made him somewhat exhausting in good weather and genuinely valuable now. The Hendersons, a young couple who'd come to the valley in September, were not fine at all. They were cold and low on supplies, and the young wife, barely older than Abigail, was trying very hard not to show how frightened she was. Silas spent an hour at their cabin. He split enough wood to last them a week and showed the husband, Tom Henderson, where he'd been making a mistake with the stove's draft. He left them with a sack of cornmeal from somewhere. Abigail didn't see him take it from anywhere. It simply appeared in his hands as if he'd planned for it. And they walked away from the Henderson cabin with Tom's "I'll pay you back in spring" hanging in the cold air behind them. "You don't expect him to pay you back," Abigail said. "He'll feel better if he thinks he will." She walked beside him through the packed snow, turning that over. That's a kind thing. The way you did that." Silas seemed momentarily unsure what to do with a direct compliment. He looked at the tree line. "It's just practical. A man who feels like a failure won't ask for help the next time he needs it. A man who thinks he's got a dead outstanding will. You've thought about this a lot." "I've watched people do winter wrong," he said. "Isolation kills faster than cold. A man who won't let his neighbors in is a man who'll be dead before February if things get hard." She thought about that for the rest of the walk home. About the specific loneliness he was describing, the self-sufficiency that curdled into something fatal. She thought about herself at the start of October, sitting in that back bedroom with her jaw set and her wall up, determined to need nothing from anyone in this valley. She thought about how that had already begun to fail. Fletcher Ames came to call the second week of December, which surprised her, and what he said surprised her more. She was alone in the cabin when the knock came. Silas was out on the far trap line, wouldn't be back for 2 hours. She opened the door to find Ames on the step, hat in hand, boots dusted with snow, his politest manner turned up to full warmth. "Mrs. Boone," he said, which was still strange to hear. "Hope I'm not intruding. I was coming up the creek and wanted to make sure you folks had weathered the snow all right." She let him in because it was cold, and because turning someone away at the door in December felt like a different kind of wrong out here than it might have elsewhere. She made coffee, and he sat at the table and made the kind of comfortable small talk that she recognized as professional behavior, the deliberate building of ease. After 10 minutes of it, he got to what he'd actually come for. "I wanted to have a word with you," he said, "about Silas, just neighborly concern." Abigail set her cup down. "What kind of concern?" "He's a generous man," Ames said, and his tone was warm in the way warm things are sometimes used to carry cold content. Generous to a fault, some might say, taking supplies to the Hendersons, propping up folks who ought to be propping themselves up. People come to depend on that. And when a man has a wife to consider, responsibilities of his own, he let it trail. "He has enough for all of it," Abigail said. "For this winter, what about the next? He's trading future security for present goodwill." Ames leaned forward slightly. "I say this as someone who respects him. A man with a family ought to think about what he's accumulating, not what he's giving away." She looked at him. She thought about what Silas had said. He knows how to be liked, knows it the way you'd know a skill. And she thought about the specific shape of what Ames was doing, which was not exactly a lie and not exactly the truth, which was something in between that wore the clothes of good advice. "I'll pass along your concern," she said, with the kind of pleasant finality that meant the conversation was over. Ames took it gracefully, finished his coffee, put his hat on, and left. She watched him go from the window, his figure moving down the creek path in the gray afternoon light, and she felt a quiet disquiet settle in her that she couldn't fully name. When Silas came home, she told him about the visit, plainly, without editorializing. He listened without interrupting. He hung his coat on the peg and came to the table and sat down, and she watched his face, which gave away less than most people's faces, but not nothing. "What did you think of what he said?" he asked her. "I think he's worried about something that benefits him to be worried about." Silas looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression that she was starting to recognize. A slight adjustment, like a recalibration, the look of a man discovering someone is more perceptive than he'd let himself hope. "He's been wanting to consolidate the Valley's winter trading for 2 years, Silas said. "If people are dependent on his store, they pay his prices. If they help each other directly," he shrugged, "then they don't need him. Then they don't need him as much." She thought about the Hendersons, the cornmeal, the way Silas had handled it. She thought about what Ames was actually asking for, under the language of husbandly prudence and reasonable caution. "He wanted me to rein you in," she said. "He wanted you to want to." It didn't work. Silas looked at her. This time the thing in his face developed further than usual before he controlled it, something that might, in a different man, in an easier moment, have been called relief. "No," he said, "I see that." They sat with that between them for a moment, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that comes after something real has been established. "Make sure you keep enough back," she said, picking up her sewing. "For us. I'm not asking you to stop helping people, but make sure we're accounted for first." "I always do." "I know, I'm saying it anyway." He almost smiled. "All right," he said. "Noted." Christmas in Blackstone Hollow was a quiet thing. There was no church, no formal gathering, just a loose tradition of people making their way to Ruth Halsey's store in the afternoon and sharing whatever they could spare. A jar of preserves, a batch of cornbread, the occasional jug of something that warmed from the inside in a different way than a stove did. Silas and Abigail went together. He'd been quiet for the 2 days before in a way that she was beginning to learn was different from his usual quiet, more interior, slightly further away, like he was carrying something he hadn't decided to put down yet. She didn't push. She was learning that about him. Pushing produced polite deflection. Patience produced actual answers. At the store, Ruth had put pine boughs on the counter, and someone had hung a string of dried berries across the window, and it was cheerful in a rough-hewn way that Abigail found she didn't mind. She talked with Marta for a long time about a sewing technique Marta used for patching heavy wool, and she watched Silas from across the room. He moved through the gathering the way he moved through the woods, without drawing attention, but present in the specific way that meant people turned toward him when they needed something. Cale Pittman clapped him on the shoulder. Tom Henderson shook his hand with both of his, the way men did when words weren't enough. Old Ben Marsh, who was 73 and had been in this valley longer than anyone, sat in his chair in the corner and said something to Silas that made Silas stop and listen with his full attention, really listen, the way she'd seen him listen to the creek for signs of where the animals moved. She watched that and felt something she'd been holding very carefully begin to loosen, just slightly, in her chest. Edmund found her near the window and stood beside her, and they looked at the room together. He looked better than he had in weeks, the color back in his face, the cold stiffness gone from his hands. The chinking in his cabin wall had held. "He goes up to check on me," Edmund said quietly, nodding toward Silas. "Did you know? Every couple of days when the weather's been rough, just shows up, does whatever needs doing, goes away." "I suspected," Abigail said. "He doesn't tell you." "No." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man assembling an apology in pieces, checking the fit of each one before committing. "I should have told you what I told him," he said, "about my health, about why Papa, I should have been straight with you from the start." She looked at her father. This man who had arranged her future without consulting her, who had done it out of a fear he couldn't admit to, who loved her in the only way he knew how to, which was imperfect and often wrong in the method, even when it was right in the intention. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She let him sit with that for a moment, and then she said, "But I understand why you didn't." Edmund nodded once, his jaw working. He was not a man who cried, and he didn't now, but she could see the effort of not doing it. Across the room, Silas glanced toward them, not intrusively, just checking in the way he checked on everything. Regular, unobtrusive, already moving on by the time she noticed. She thought, "I have been looking for the catch for 2 months. I have been waiting for him to become someone easier to hold at a distance." She was beginning to accept that he simply wasn't going to. January came down on the valley like a judgment. The temperature dropped below anything Abigail had a reference point for. Cold that wasn't just uncomfortable but actually dangerous, the kind that would take fingers and toes and ears without announcement, that turned every outdoor task into a calculation about acceptable risk. Silas started timing his trap checks by the weather, waiting for the slight lifts in temperature, rarely staying out more than an hour at a stretch. The valley pulled in on itself. People kept to their own cabins, and the distances between homesteads, short enough in October to walk easily, became serious undertakings. Abigail kept track of who she hadn't heard from in more than a few days and mentioned it to Silas, and he'd work it into his rounds with the matter-of-fact practicality she'd come to rely on. She was relying on him. She'd noticed this and stopped fighting it. One afternoon, stuck inside by a wind that Silas said was too sharp to go out in, and she had learned enough to defer to his readings of the weather, she found herself at the table with her sewing and found herself stuck, not from lack of thread or light, but from a kind of restlessness she couldn't resolve. She put it down and picked it up and put it down again. "What is it?" Silas asked from across the table without looking up from the trap mechanism he was oiling. "Nothing." He didn't say anything, which was the correct response to a nothing that was obviously something. She looked at her hands. "I used to teach," she said, "back in Carthage. Schoolroom, 20-odd children, 7 years to 14. I was good at it." She paused. "I haven't done anything that felt like that since I got here. Anything that felt like mine." Silas set down the trap mechanism. He was giving her his full attention, which was something she'd noticed he did in a particular way. Not performed attention, not the forward lean and engaged expression that some people used as a social signal, just the simple turning of his actual focus. "What would you do with it?" he said. "Here, the Greer children, the Henderson kids, when they have some. 6 children in this valley who are spending winter without. There's nothing for them to do and nobody teaching them anything." "No," he agreed, "there isn't. I thought about asking Ruth if we could use the store for a few hours a week, when the weather allows people to come in." He looked at her for a moment. Have you asked her? Not yet. Why not? She opened her mouth and closed it. The real answer was that she'd been waiting for something she couldn't name. Permission, maybe, or confirmation that it was a reasonable idea, or simply someone to not look at her like it was foolish. Silas looked at her like none of those things. He looked at her the way he looked at something that made sense, that fit into the world correctly. Talk to Ruth, he said. She'll say yes. You don't know that. Ruth Halsey has been watching these children run wild in her store every Saturday for years. She'll say yes before you finish asking. Abigail looked at him. You've thought about this. I've noticed you looking at the Greer kids, he said simply, the way you watch them when they're at the store. I figured you'd get there eventually. She hadn't realized she was that readable to him, and the realization sat somewhere between unsettling and something else she wasn't prepared to name. I'll talk to her this week, she said. Good. She picked up her sewing again, and the wind pushed hard against the north wall, and the stove ticked and settled, and she thought about a schoolroom in Missouri and a schoolroom in a trading post in a mountain valley, and how strange it was that the second one felt somehow more possible. She didn't say that to him, but she thought he probably knew it anyway. Ruth said yes before Abigail finished asking. She had walked down to the store on a Tuesday when the temperature had lifted enough to make the creek path manageable, rehearsing how she'd frame it, thinking through the practical objections Ruth might raise. Space, noise, disruption to business. She got through maybe 4 sentences of her prepared explanation before Ruth held up one hand. When do you want to start? Ruth said. Abigail blinked. I thought you might want to think about it. I've been watching Cale Pittman's youngest draw on my floorboards with a stick for 3 winters, Ruth said. I don't need to think about it. When do you want to start? They settled on Wednesday mornings, 2 hours, when the store was slowest. Abigail went home and told Silas, and he said, I figured, with the particular flatness that meant he was pleased but wasn't going to perform it, and she almost laughed. The first Wednesday, she had 4 children, 2 of the Greer kids, the Pittman boy, and a girl named Clara Marsh, whose grandfather was Old Ben. They sat on crates and upturned buckets around the low table Ruth cleared for them, and Abigail taught them letters and sums with chalk on a piece of dark board she'd borrowed from the smithy. And it was loud and imprecise, and one of the Greer boys fell off his crate twice for reasons that were never fully explained. And she walked home afterward with cold feet and sore hands, and a feeling in her chest she hadn't had since Missouri. She told Silas about it over supper, and it was the most she'd talked in one stretch since arriving in the valley. She talked about the Pittman boy, who was slower with letters but had a mathematical mind that surprised her. She talked about Clara Marsh, who was 8 years old and had already taught herself to read from her grandfather's Bible and was hungry for more than what it could give her. She talked about what she wanted to do the following week, how she'd structure it differently, what she'd bring. Silas ate and listened and asked the right questions, not many of them, just enough to show he was actually tracking what she was saying rather than waiting for his turn to talk. When she finally wound down, he said, Claire Marsh, Ben's been worried about that girl. Her mother died 2 years ago. He's been raising her himself. She didn't mention that. She wouldn't. She's got too much pride for 8 years old. Gets it from Ben. Abigail thought about Clara. Her serious dark eyes, the careful way she'd held the chalk like it was something valuable. I'll bring extra materials next week, she said. Something she can take home and work on. Silas nodded. He reached across the table and refilled her coffee without being asked. The kind of small, habitual gesture that people made when they'd gotten comfortable with each other. And she noticed it and said nothing. And that noticing and not saying became its own kind of acknowledgement. January deepened and the cold held and the valley settled into the grinding endurance of serious winter. The schoolroom Wednesdays became a fixture. Attendance crept up to 6 children, then 7, then 9 on a warm for January morning when Marta Svensson brought her 2 foster grandchildren down from the North Homestead and said without preamble, they need it more than I need quiet. The children were the best part of Abigail's week. They were also exhausting in the particular way that children who'd been cooped up since November were exhausting. Too much energy and not enough outlets and a collective tendency to escalate every activity until something broke. She came home from the 3rd Wednesday with chalk dust in her hair and a headache behind her left eye, and the firm conviction that the Pittman boy, whose name was Ned, had been placed on this earth specifically to test patient people. She sat down at the table and put her head in her hands for a moment. She heard Silas come in from the barn, heard him stop when he saw her. "Bad?" he said. "Ned Pittman took Clara Marsh's chalk and ate half of it before I got it back." A pause. "Ate it?" "On purpose, for the reaction." She looked up. "He got one." Silas's mouth moved in a way that was definitely suppressing something. "Is he all right?" He seemed deeply satisfied with himself, which I found more alarming than the chalk. She dropped her head again. "I should be better at this by now. I taught for a year and a half." "You taught in a schoolroom in Missouri in April," Silas said, hanging up his coat. "Not in a general store in January with children who haven't been outdoors in 6 weeks. He came to the table and set a cup of water in front of her. "Different problem." I snapped at him, after the chalk. I didn't yell, but I was sharper than I meant to be, and he went very quiet, and that was worse than the chalk. "Did you fix it?" "I talked to him after, before they left. He's a lonely kid, I think. The reaction seeking is—" She stopped, organized it. "He doesn't have much at home. His brothers are older, and his father isn't a man who pays attention." Silas sat down across from her. "You talked to him one-on-one?" "Yes." "And?" "And he showed me a drawing he'd done on the back of a scrap of paper. A horse. It was actually very good, better than I'd have expected from a 9-year-old. "Did you tell him that?" "Yes." "Then you didn't do badly," Silas said. "You just did it the hard way." She looked at him across the table. In the low light of the cabin, with the stove going and the wind outside doing its usual work against the walls, he looked like what he was, a man who had been out in the cold all day and was tired and still paying attention because something mattered to her. He wasn't performing concern. He wasn't managing her. He was just there, present and specific, a person she was allowed to talk to about the actual texture of her day. She had not had that in a long time. She hadn't been sure she'd have it here. "Thank you," she said, "for listening to me go on about it." "You're not going on. You're thinking out loud." He paused. "I like when you think out loud." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at her water cup. "I should start supper," she said. "I already put the beans on," he said, "when I came in from the barn." Of course he had. Momoshen. It was Marta Svensson who told her about the original arrangement. Not deliberately, not as information she thought Abigail was missing. Marta said it the way you say something you assume the other person already knows, which made it land harder. It was a Saturday in late January, and they were standing near the window in Ruth's store while the men talked and the children pushed each other near the door. Marta had been watching Silas across the room for a moment, the specific look of someone making a quiet assessment. "He fought your father on it, you know," Marta said, not looking at Abigail. "The arrangement." Abigail went still. "What do you mean, fought him?" "When Edmund first came to him. Silas didn't like the idea of a woman being moved into a situation without real choice." Marta sipped her coffee. "He told Edmund he'd help however he could, but not like that. Not with a woman who hadn't decided herself." The room was loud around them, and Abigail heard none of it. "He agreed to it," she said carefully. "Eventually. Edmund was persistent, and Silas understood the situation, the past closing, your father's health." Marta glanced at her. "But Silas made him add a condition. Are you aware of the condition?" "No," Abigail said. Her voice was very even, which was the voice she used when something was happening inside that she didn't want visible. That you'd have the full winter to decide. That in spring, if you wanted to leave, if you wanted to dissolve the arrangement, go somewhere else, start over, he would not oppose it, would help you do it practically. Money, a letter of good standing, whatever you needed. Marta set down her cup. "Your father agreed. Silas wouldn't have it any other way." Abigail looked across the room at Silas, who was listening to something Ben Marsh was telling him, with his full, unperformed attention, the same way he listened to everything. She thought about October. She thought about the papers she'd signed, feeling like a door being closed on her. No exit, no agency. The thing done to her rather than chosen. She had been wrong, not about what had happened, but about the structure underneath it. There had been an exit the whole time. Silas had put it there himself, before she'd ever arrived. He had not told her. She turned that over and examined it from different angles, and found that she couldn't decide quite what she felt about it. Anger was there briefly. Why hadn't he told her? It would have changed October for her, made those first weeks less airless. But under the anger was something else that kept pressing up through it, something that had to do with the specific nature of what he'd done. He hadn't used the information as currency, hadn't offered it to make her like him, or trust him, or feel indebted. He'd simply made sure she had the freedom and then not mentioned it, because telling her would have been a way of making it about himself. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, and she thought about it walking home, and she thought about it making supper, and Silas noticed something in her silence. She could tell. He gave her the space of it without asking, which was both considerate and slightly maddening. After supper, after the dishes, she sat down at the table and said, "Marta told me about the condition." Silas was quiet for a beat. He didn't pretend to not know what she meant. "I wondered if she would." "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why not?" He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "Because I didn't want it to be a thing you were aware of," he said. "I didn't want you being nice to me because you felt like you owed me something, or being careful around me because you knew I could hold it over you." He paused. "I wanted you to make up your own mind about me, based on what I actually was, not based on what I'd arranged." She looked at him. Outside, the January wind was at the walls again, its nightly persistence. "That is the most complicated, simple thing I've ever heard," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know it probably doesn't make complete sense." "It makes sense," she said. "It just—" She stopped, started again. "You should have told me in October, when I was so angry, Silas. I was so angry at the whole thing, feeling like I had no choice, and you had already made sure I had one, and you didn't say a word." "I know. I'm sorry for that part." "Are you?" "Yes. I thought it would seem like— I was afraid it would seem like I was asking for credit for something I should have done anyway." She sat with that. She thought, this man is not easy to understand, not because he's complicated in a frustrating way, but because his reasons are always better than she expects them to be, and that kept requiring her to revise him, kept requiring her to see him differently than she'd prepared to. "I'm not angry," she said finally, though she had been, briefly, and he probably knew it. "But tell me things. Going forward, don't manage what I know." "I'll do that." "I mean it." "I know you do," he said, "and I will." She believed him. That was the thing she noticed, sitting in the lamplit cabin in January with the winter outside doing its worst. She believed him without working at it. The belief was just there, simple and unannounced, like a shift in weather she hadn't seen coming. The second crisis of the winter came in February, and it started with Fletcher Ames. He'd been quiet since December, since that visit to the cabin that had ended without the result he'd wanted. Abigail had seen him at the Saturday gatherings, civil and smooth as always, and she had watched him the way she watched anything she'd been warned to watch, without making the watching obvious. What Silas hadn't told her, partly, she suspected, because he hadn't fully worked out the shape of it himself, was that Ames had been buying up debt. It was the kind of thing that happened slowly and was hard to see until you were standing in the middle of it. A bad harvest season, an expensive piece of equipment, a family illness. The Valley people borrowed from wherever they could, and Ames had been the willing lender since his first winter here, and the loans had terms that were reasonable sounding in summer and considerably less so after 2 hard winters. Kel Pittman came to the cabin on a February morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Abigail recognized as the particular shame of a man who'd come to ask for something he didn't know how to ask for. She let him in and made coffee, and let Silas come in from the barn before anything was said. What Cale said was this. Ames had called in 2 loans simultaneously, his and his brother Duff's. The amount together was more than either of them had in spring prospect of earning, and Ames had put a deadline on it that fell before the pass opened. Silas sat with that for a moment. His face did the thing it did when he was thinking hard. Very still, eyes not quite focused on anything in the room. "Both loans at once," he said. "Yeah." Cale turned his hat. "And Tom Henderson. He got the same notice yesterday. And the widow Fenwick up on the North Branch." Silas looked at Abigail. She was already thinking what he was thinking, she could tell from the look. This was not about individual debts. This was something systematic. "He can't take the land," Silas said. "Not legally, not on a debt like this." "He's not talking about land," Cale said. "He's talking about The terms say he can claim first right to the spring pelts, all of them, and equipment. Equipment was everything out here. Without traps, a trapper had no income, or couldn't maintain what little they had. He'd clean you out, Abigail said. Cale's jaw tightened. Basically. After Cale left, Abigail stood in the middle of the cabin and felt the specific cold of something that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "How many people in the valley have loans with him?" she said. "I've been thinking about that," Silas said. He was standing at the window, looking out at the white yard. "More than I knew. He's been quiet about it. This is what he was protecting in December," she said, "when he came here. He wasn't worried about your generosity costing you. He was worried about you keeping people self-sufficient enough to pay him back." Silas turned from the window. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him being struck by something he hadn't fully seen. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it. So what do we do?" The question landed between them, and neither of them had an immediate answer, and that was all right. She had learned that Silas didn't respond well to pressure for quick answers. He thought, and then he spoke, and what he said was worth waiting for. What he said, after a long moment, was, "We find out how many people are in the same position, all of them. And we figure out how much it actually is, total, because Ames is counting on people feeling isolated with their own debt. He's counting on nobody comparing notes. And if we add it up, and it's more than any of us can handle." Silas looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen there before, not quite anger. Anger was too simple for it. More like the expression of a man deciding that something is not going to happen, not because he has the specific power to stop it yet, but because he is going to find that power. "Then we figure out a different way," he said. "Together." She thought about the valley, Marta and the Pittmans and the Hendersons and Clara Marsh's grandfather and the 9 children who came to a general store every Wednesday to learn to read because there was nowhere else. She thought about the community Silas had been quietly holding together all winter, meal by meal, and cord of wood by cord of wood, and silent late-night repair by silent late-night repair. Fletcher Ames had been patient. He'd waited until the coldest, most locked-down point of winter, when the pass was sealed and nobody could leave and help from outside was impossible, and he'd moved. It was, she had to admit, well-timed, which told her something about him she should have known more firmly from December. "Start with Ruth," she said. "She knows who owes what to whom in this valley better than anyone." Silas nodded. He was already reaching for his coat. "I'm coming with you," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "You said together," she said. "I did," he said, and he waited for her to get her coat. They walked down the creek in the February cold, side by side, their breath making small clouds that the wind took, and the mountains stood on every side of them, gray and white and immovable, and the valley lay between them, small and cold and worth the trouble of protecting. She kept up with his pace without trying to, because she'd been walking this creek for 4 months now, and it was hers as much as it was his, and she knew every rut and ice-slick bend of it, and that knowledge felt like something she hadn't expected. Not captivity, exactly the opposite. It felt like belonging. Ruth Halsey had been keeping records since her first winter in Blackstone Hollow, which was 11 years ago. In a ledger she kept under the counter in a wooden box that also contained a small pistol and a deed of title that nobody in the valley had ever been allowed to read. She was not a sentimental woman, and she was not a careless one, and when Silas and Abigail came through her door that February afternoon, she looked at their faces and pulled out the ledger before either of them said a word. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. They sat at the back table, the one Ruth used for accounts, away from the windows, and she opened the ledger and walked them through what she knew. It took the better part of an hour, and by the end of it the picture was worse than Silas had estimated, and worse than Abigail had feared. 7 families. 7 separate loans with Fletcher Ames, ranging from amounts that were manageable individually to amounts that were, in combination with the others, a kind of stranglehold on the valley's productive capacity. Ames hadn't taken anything yet. He'd extended credit, been patient, been collegial, and now it was February, and the pass was closed, and he had everyone exactly where patient and collegial had been designed to put them. "He's been planning this since before his second winter," Ruth said. She said it without heat, the way she said most things, as information, not accusation. "He understood how valley debt works. How isolated people take loans they wouldn't take if they had options. Does he have legal standing on all of it? Abigail asked. The terms are real. The signatures are real. Ruth closed the ledger. Whether a circuit judge would uphold collection before the pass opens is a different question, but there's no circuit judge within 100 miles until May. Silas was quiet, his hands flat on the table. He'd been listening to everything with that interior stillness of his, the kind that Abigail had learned to read as the opposite of inaction. He was moving fast, internally. What's the total exposure, he said, if we pool it? Ruth told him. Abigail watched Silas absorb the number. He didn't flinch, but something shifted in the set of his jaw. I can cover part of it, he said. Silas, Abigail started. I've got the spring pelts in a reserve I've been building for 3 years. It's not enough for all of it, but it's a start. You'd clean yourself out. Not completely. Close enough. She looked at him directly. That's not the answer. You can't buy 7 families out of debt and call it solved. You'd just be the one holding the debt instead of Ames. Ruth was watching this exchange with the expression of a woman who had been waiting to see what Abigail Mercer was actually made of, and was now getting her answer. She said nothing. Silas looked at Abigail. She could see him weighing it, the instinct to carry it alone against whatever he saw in her face right now, which was not admiration for the instinct. Then what? He said. You said together, she said. You meant the 2 of us. I mean the whole valley. She looked at Ruth. If everyone who has a loan with him is also everyone who he expects to pay him back, then they have more leverage collectively than he does. He can't strip 7 households at once without the whole valley seeing exactly what he is, without it becoming a story that travels when the pass opens. Ruth's expression shifted slightly, which on Ruth was equivalent to visible approval. Reputation matters to Ames, she said. He's been building one. He wants to expand. He's talked about a second trading post in the spring, a supply arrangement with the settlements west of the pass. Then he needs people to believe he's a fair dealer, Abigail said, which means he needs this to stay quiet, which means he might negotiate, or it means he knows that and is counting on everyone being too ashamed of their debt to compare notes, Silas said, which is what's kept this contained until now. Right. So the first thing we do is make sure everyone knows everyone else is in the same position. She paused. No more shame working in his favor. Can you get them all together? Silas thought about it. Not easily in February. The weather... Saturday, Ruth said. They're already coming in. I can make sure the right people stay after. The Saturday gathering that week was indistinguishable from any other, on the surface. People came in from the cold, stamped snow off their boots, talked about the weather and the week and who needed what. Children ran through legs. Coffee was poured. Abigail watched Fletcher Ames work the room and understood him better now than she had in December. He was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of social fluency that required real intelligence and attention. He remembered details about people, asked the right questions, made each person feel specifically seen. It was a skill, exactly as Silas had said, and it had been used with great precision. He found her near the stove and came to stand beside her with his usual warmth, and she gave him the polite surface of her attention while underneath it she was watching everything. How are you settling in? He said. Getting through this winter all right? Better than expected, she said. Silas keeps a good cabin. He paused, just a beat. I hope he's not overextending himself. I heard he's been doing rounds, the Hendersons, the Pittmans. People look out for each other here, she said pleasantly. Of course they do. He smiled. I just think about the sustainability of it. Generosity has limits. She sipped her coffee. I found it has more than people expect when it's organized well. Something in his expression registered the word organized, and she watched the registration happen and kept her own face easy and open. After he left to work another corner of the room, Ruth caught her eye from behind the counter and tilted her head once toward the back. One by one, through the next hour, the right people drifted toward the back table. Cale and Duff Pittman. Tom Henderson, shoulders high with the tension of a man carrying something heavy in public. Marta Svensson, who arrived with her coffee and sat down with the air of a woman who'd been expecting this meeting. The widow Fenwick, small and sharp-eyed, who'd walked 2 miles in February cold because Ruth's message had reached her. And Ben Marsh, who was 7 decades old and had been in this valley so long he was practically geological. Silas was already there when Abigail came to sit down. He'd gotten there early, she realized, made sure everyone had a place, made sure the conversation around the edges of the room was loud enough to cover what was happening at the table. He hadn't announced himself as running anything. He was just there, ready, the same way he was always just there. She sat beside him. "All right," she said quietly, and looked around the table. "You all know why you're here." The relief of it, of not having to pretend, moved around the table visibly. Tom Henderson let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since November. The widow Fenwick set her coffee down with a small, decisive click. "He moved on all of us the same week," Duff Pittman said. His voice was tight. "Same week. That's not coincidence." "No," Abigail agreed. "It isn't." "What do we do about it?" Tom said. "First, does anyone here actually have the means to pay what he's asking before the pass opens?" Silas said. Nobody spoke. "Then we're all in the same position. And that matters." He paused. "He sent notices to 7 households separately because he expected you to feel alone with it. That's the first thing that stops today." Ben Marsh had been quiet through this, looking at his coffee with hooded eyes. Now he spoke. His voice, the slow, careful voice of a man who'd seen things resolve and not resolve over a long life. "What's to stop him from just waiting us out? Spring comes, pass opens. We still owe what we owe." "The story," Abigail said. "What he did, how he did it, becomes a story that goes out through the pass when it opens. Travelers talk, merchants talk. A man who wants to expand his business can't afford to be known for this in settlements he hasn't reached yet." "He'll say it's just business," Cale Pittman said, not arguing, testing. "It is just business," Marta said flatly. "That's not the point. The point is how it looks. A man who timed his debt collection to the closed pass, in the worst winter in recent memory, hitting widows and young families simultaneously. That's a story with a shape to it. People remember the shape," Ruth said from her position near the edge of the table. "I'd also suggest that some of what he's doing may not hold up to examination. I've read those loan terms. There's language in them that a judge might read differently than Ames intends." "We don't have a judge," Fenwick said. "We will in May." Tom Henderson rubbed his face with both hands. "That's 3 months." "Yes," Silas said. "It is. And here's what 3 months looks like." He laid out the practical reality of it, the same way he laid out everything, plainly, without embellishment, without false comfort. He had enough in reserve to service the interest on several of the loans, buying time without emptying his own stores completely. Ruth could formalize an arrangement that pooled what resources they had. The collective spring pelts, if committed early, represented enough value to address most of the principal. It wasn't a clean solution. It was a hand-to-hand fight in February, with the mountain sealed and no help coming. "He won't like it," Cale said. "No," Silas agreed. "He won't. He might get ugly about it." Silas looked at him. "Let him." Ames came to the cabin 4 days later. He came alone, which Abigail noted, and he came in the evening when the light was low, which she also noted. She opened the door before he knocked because she'd been watching the creek path from the window. "Mrs. Boone," he said. His warmth was still there, but it was doing more work now. "I wonder if I might speak with Silas." "You can speak with both of us," she said, and stood back to let him in. Silas was at the table. He didn't stand, which was also a choice. Ames sat when Abigail gestured to the chair, and she remained standing, which she did deliberately. "I understand there's been some discussion," Ames said, "about the outstanding loans." "There has," Silas said. "I want you to understand my position. Those are legitimate debts with legitimate terms. I'm not asking for anything that wasn't agreed to." "The terms were agreed to," Abigail said. "The timing of the call was your choice." Ames looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating in real time, the expression of a man who'd expected less precision from her. "Timing is within my legal rights." "It is," she said, "and what we choose to do with information about your timing is within ours." "What does that mean?" It means that, come spring, there will be travelers through this valley," she said. "There are always travelers, and travelers talk. And the specific story of how a trading post operator called in 7 loans simultaneously in February in a sealed valley during the hardest winter in years. That's a story with a shape that travels efficiently. Ames was quiet for a moment. He looked at Silas. You've been organizing against me. I've been making sure my neighbors know each other's situation, Silas said. That's the same thing. Is it? The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the February wind went on with its business, indifferent. What do you want? Ames said. His voice had dropped the warmth now. It was still controlled, still professional, but the performance had been set down. Abigail sat down at the table then, across from him, level. Restructured terms, she said. Reasonable repayment windows that begin after the pass opens. No equipment claims. Interest rates that reflect the original agreements, not whatever escalation clauses are written in the fine print. And if I decline, then the story goes out in spring, to every settlement, every trader, every merchant you hope to do business with. She held his gaze. You've built a reputation here that you want to take somewhere else. We understand that. We're not asking you to absorb a loss, so we're asking you to take a reasonable return on what is, by any honest accounting, a sound investment in this valley's capacity to pay you back. Ames looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. She negotiates for you. She negotiates for the valley, Silas said, same as I do. Something moved across Ames's face. Not quite respect, but the recognition of a thing that had been underestimated. He looked back at Abigail. I'll want to see specific terms in writing, he said. Ruth Halsey has them prepared, Abigail said. She's been expecting you. He came to terms. Not graciously, and not without a final attempt to claw back some of what he'd conceded, but he came to them. Ruth's written terms held up. The collective position of 7 households, plus the practical reality of a reputation he was not willing to trade for a winter's accelerated collection, was more than his leverage could overcome. It didn't make him a different man. He was what he'd always been. But the valley knew it now, clearly, in a way it hadn't before, and that knowledge changed the shape of every transaction going forward. The night after Ames accepted the terms, Abigail sat at the cabin table after supper and didn't pick up her sewing. She just sat, and Silas sat across from her, and they were quiet for a while in the particular way they were quiet now. Not the careful quiet of 2 strangers managing proximity, but the quiet of people who didn't need to fill space. I want to ask you something, she said. All right? When my father came to you, when he first proposed this, she kept her eyes on the table, choosing words. What did you actually think? Not what you decided. What you thought first, before you decided anything. Silas was quiet for a moment. She didn't rush him. I thought it was a bad idea, he said. For you. Not for me. What do you mean, for you? He looked at the lamp. I don't know what I was. I'd been here 6 years by myself. That's a long time to be alone with your own habits. He paused. I thought I was past wanting things to be different. But your father sat across from me the way you're sitting across from me now, and he talked about you. About who you were, what you'd given up, what he was afraid would happen to you. And I thought, he stopped. What? I thought, that's a person I'd like to know. The lamp made small sounds. The stove made small sounds. Outside, the February cold went on, reliable as it always was. She looked at him, this man she'd been assigned to and had tried to hold at a distance for 3 months, and had failed, comprehensively, to hold at a distance. She thought about October, and the copper ring, and the papers signed at Ruth's table, and everything that had come after, the mouse, the trap lines, the chinking in her father's wall, the schoolroom, the table in February with 7 frightened people and a ledger, and the shape of something that might become a real community if it survived the winter. She thought about the spring, the pass opening, the choice that had been waiting there since the beginning, the one Silas had put there himself and never mentioned. I'm not leaving in spring, she said. Silas went very still. I'm saying it now so you know, she said. Not because I feel trapped and have made my peace with it. Not because it's the practical thing. She looked at him directly. Because I don't want to. He didn't say anything for a moment. She could see him working to keep his face neutral and not entirely succeeding. Something moved behind his eyes that was more than he usually let surface. Abigail, I'm not finished, she said. I need you to understand that I know there's a difference between staying because you've run out of exits and staying because the place has become, because the person has become. She stopped. started differently. I was so angry in October. I was angry at you for something that wasn't your fault, and you never held it against me, not once, and that should have told me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. You were right to be angry, he said. The situation was what it was. I'm talking about you. She held his gaze. I'm talking about who you are, specifically, not the situation. I've been watching you since October, and I cannot find where you stop being what you appear to be. He looked at her with the full weight of that careful attention, and for once he didn't redirect it. He let her see it. I'm not who you appear to be, she said. I've been difficult and cold, and I used your patience against you because it was easier than admitting it was the thing I most needed. You weren't difficult, he said. Silas, you were careful, he said. That's different. A pause. You had every reason to be careful. She looked at the table, then back at him. I'm done being careful with you, she said. That's what I'm trying to say. The fire in the stove had burned down low, and the lamp between them threw shadows that moved when the draft moved, and outside the valley lay cold and white and sealed, and spring was still weeks away, and none of that mattered in the way she'd once thought it would. Silas reached across the table, slowly, without pretense, and covered her hand with his. His hand was rough and warm and steady, which was exactly what she should have expected. She turned her hand over and held it. The hand-holding at the table lasted maybe 2 minutes before Silas quietly let go, and they both found reasons to look elsewhere. He at the stove, she at the lamp. And neither of them said anything more about it that night. That was all right. It didn't need more words. It had been said, and they both knew it had been said. And some things are better left to settle in their own time, rather than being handled to death with language. She woke the next morning to find he'd already stoked the stove and left coffee on the trivet, same as always, except that when she came out of the back room, he looked up from his work and something in his face was different from what it had been every other morning since October. Not dramatic, just open, in a way it hadn't been before. Like a window that had been latched from the inside and was now simply not latched. She poured her coffee and sat down and said, "Good morning." "Morning," he said. That was all. And it was enough. And they both knew it was enough. And the winter went on outside with perfect indifference, while inside the cabin something had shifted on its axis and would not shift back. March came in the way. March came in the mountains, not gently, not as any kind of relief, but as a grudging reduction in hostility. The temperature lifted by increments so small you only noticed them when you realized one morning that you hadn't thought about the cold the previous afternoon. The creek ice cracked and groaned. The light changed its angle, came in lower through the cabin window, and hit the table in a way it hadn't since fall, and Abigail found herself sitting in that rectangle of pale light one morning with her hands around her coffee cup, not thinking about anything in particular, and realized she was content, not happy in the sharp, uncomplicated way of a problem solved, content in the way of a life that had found its shape. She examined that feeling with the same careful attention she'd been trained to bring to things she didn't trust, and she found it held up. The Wednesday schoolroom had grown to 11 children by March. Clara Marsh had surpassed everyone else in reading comprehension, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention, and Abigail had started bringing extra material specifically for her. A worn collection of essays she'd carried from Missouri, a book of geography with illustrations that Clara treated with the reverence other people reserved for sacred objects. Ned Pittman, the chalk eater, had produced 3 more drawings that Abigail had quietly kept, because they were genuinely good, and she didn't want them thrown away. She was going to find a way to tell his father about the talent, which was a conversation she was not looking forward to, because Cale Pittman was a man who thought about practical utility and not much else. But she would have it. She had started keeping a notebook of the children, not formal records, just observations. What they were good at, what frightened them, what kinds of problems made their eyes light up. She'd done the same in Missouri, and it had made her a better teacher, and she did it here because the habit was hers, and she was keeping it. Silas found the notebook on the table one evening and looked at it with her permission, turning the pages slowly, and she watched him read her cramped teacher's handwriting and take it seriously in the way he took everything seriously. "You should keep doing this," he said when he set it down. "I intend to. I mean, beyond this winter, past the spring." He looked at her. "The valley needs this, permanently. There's no schoolhouse. There could be. She looked at him. He said it the way he said things he'd been thinking about for a while and had decided to put down in front of her. Not a plan, yet, but the bones of one. You've been thinking about a building, she said. Summer project. If there's enough interest. I talked to Ben Marsh. Ben said yes. Ben said yes before I finished asking. A beat. Sound familiar? She laughed. Genuinely, without catching it first, the kind of laugh that came from being surprised into it. Silas watched it happen with something on his face that was unambiguously fond and didn't bother being anything else. She thought, this is what it looks like when you choose a person rather than a situation. The situation had been forced. Everything after had been choice, accumulated daily in small increments, until she was here, laughing at the table in March with a man she trusted completely, in a valley that had become hers, teaching children in a general store on Wednesdays, holding her own ground. She hadn't seen it happen because it happened the way real things happened, gradually, without announcement, until it was simply true. The pass opened the second week of April, earlier than expected. The first travelers came through on a Tuesday, a family with a laden wagon and the dazed look of people who had been moving for days and weren't sure they'd arrived anywhere yet. They stopped at Ruth's for supplies and news, and the hollow absorbed them with the quiet efficiency of a community that knew how to do this. Abigail was at the store when they came in. She helped Ruth weigh out the cornmeal and answered questions about the valley with the fluency of someone who'd been here long enough to know it. And the traveler's wife, a woman about her own age with a baby on her hip and another child clinging to her skirt, looked at her with the particular gratitude of a woman who had been talking to nobody useful for a long time. "Is it a good place?" the woman asked. Her name was Della. She had honest eyes and a sensible coat and the look of someone who had been through something and come out harder and more practical for it. Abigail thought about how to answer that. The honest version was complicated. It was cold and isolated, and the winters were serious, and there were people in it who would take advantage of you if you let them. And the nearest doctor was 4 days' ride, and there were nights when the mountains felt like walls rather than landscape. "It's a real place," she said. "It'll ask things of you, but there's people here who'll stand beside you while it does." Della looked at her for a moment and seemed to hear the full version, the complicated one, underneath the simple one. She nodded slowly. "That's more than most places offer," she said. "Yes," Abigail agreed, "it is." She thought about that exchange for the rest of the day, about what she'd said without planning to. It's a real place, and what she'd meant by it, which had everything to do with the winter she'd just survived. Not the cold, not the practical hardships, not even the business with Ames. What made it real was the people in it, the specific texture of how they'd managed, the fact that hardship had been survived together rather than alone, and that surviving together had made them into something they hadn't been before. She had come here in October believing she was being put somewhere against her will. She had spent the winter discovering that location was never the point. The point was always who you were in it, and who stood beside you, and what you were willing to give and receive without it being a transaction. Edmund's health had been the thing neither of them spoke about directly, which was the Mercer family way of dealing with things that were frightening. He looked better in April than he had in December. The winter's enforced stillness had, paradoxically, been easier on him than the exertion of settling in had been. But he was thinner than he'd been in Missouri, and there was something careful in the way he moved that hadn't been there before. Silas had been quietly watching this all winter. Abigail knew because she'd been watching Silas watch it, and she understood by now how he processed concern, internally, practically, then in action, without broadcasting any of the steps between. In early April, he built an addition onto Edmund's shack. Not a grand thing, just a room with better insulation and a smaller, more efficient stove, the kind that held heat longer and demanded less fuel. He did it over 4 days while Abigail ran interference, keeping Edmund at the cabin on pretext that Edmund saw through immediately but was too touched to puncture. When it was done, she walked her father over to see it, and Edmund stood in the doorway of the new room for a long moment without saying anything. "Silas did this," Edmund said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Edmund was quiet. He put his hand on the door frame, which was solid and true, no gaps. "I've been trying to figure out how to apologize to you," he said, "for October, for the way I handled it. Papa, let me say it. He turned to look at her. He was an old man, she realized, in a way he hadn't been when they left Missouri. Not ancient, not even elderly, just crossed some threshold in the past winter that she hadn't watched him cross. I was scared. I thought I was doing the practical thing, the protecting thing. I didn't ask you because I was afraid you'd say no, and then I wouldn't know how to keep you safe. I know, she said. That doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. She looked at her father, this complicated man she loved with the specific exhaustion that came from loving someone who couldn't help making things harder. But it makes it understandable. And you can't ask more from people than what they could manage with what they had. Edmund's jaw worked. You sound like him. I know. That's not a criticism. He looked at the doorframe again. He's a good man, Abigail. I knew it when I wrote to him. I just didn't know how to make you see it without making me think it was your idea rather than something I could discover for myself. Yes. If you'd asked me, she said carefully, I might have said yes. I was 20 years old and I'd just buried my future and started over. I might have been willing to try if someone had given me the choice. Edmund absorbed that. It clearly cost him something. I didn't give you enough credit, he said. No, you didn't. They stood in the doorway of the new room together, father and daughter, the April light coming through the new window at an angle that showed up all the dust motes floating in the still air, and Abigail felt the specific exhausted love she had for him settle into something quieter. Not resolved. Grief and frustration didn't resolve. They just found somewhere to live that wasn't in the throat, but bearable. Thank him for me, Edmund said. Thank him yourself, she said. He's your son-in-law. Edmund almost smiled. I suppose he is. The Valley wedding was nothing like the ceremony in October. That had been a practical arrangement witnessed by people who were essentially strangers. This was different in every way that mattered. Not grander, not more elaborate, but chosen. When Abigail told Silas in late April that she wanted to do it properly, in front of the people who had become their community, he looked at her for a long moment and said, You sure? And she said, Don't ask me that. And he almost smiled. Ruth Halsey officiated again. The store was full. Not just the Hollows people, but the newcomers who'd settled since the pass opened, the Della and her husband, 2 other families who'd arrived in April. The children were there, all 11 of them, cleaned up to varying degrees of success. Ned Pittman had already drawn on his own sleeve with a piece of charcoal before the thing started, and Abigail saw it and caught his eye, and he put his hands behind his back with the expression of someone who was going to need watching. Marta Svensson wore her good dress, which Abigail had never seen before. Ben Marsh sat in the front with Clara on his knee, and Clara had a ribbon in her hair that was slightly crooked and perfect. Edmund stood beside his daughter and did the thing a father did, which was put her hand in the hand of the man she'd chosen and then step back and try to hold himself together, which he mostly managed. When Ruth said the words, Abigail listened to them in a way she hadn't in October. She listened to each one and found them true, individually, the way you checked a line of work before you committed your weight to it. She had earned the knowledge to know they were true, which was something October hadn't given her, and this April day was full of. Silas said his part in the same flat, even voice he used for everything, and it was not romantic, and it was not dramatic, and it was absolutely real, the words coming from somewhere in him that had nothing to do with performance. She said hers back, direct and steady, and felt the thing complete itself. Not like a circle closing, but like a foundation being fully laid, the last stone seated, the structure now able to carry weight. He put the copper band back on her finger, the same one from October. She'd kept it, worn it all winter, even in the months when she hadn't been sure of anything. She looked at it now and thought, I wore this through the worst winter this valley has seen, and it held up, and so did I, and so did he. Ruth said they were married. They were married. The room made noise, not elegant noise, the particular noise of rough-handed people who were happy and showed it loudly. Children shouting for reasons that had nothing to do with the occasion. Cale Pittman dropping something in the back. Marta Svensson clapping with the firm decisiveness she brought to all physical acts. Silas looked at her. Just looked for a moment, with everything he didn't usually put on his face. She held the look and let it be what it was. Summer arrived with the sudden generosity of mountain summers, as if the valley were making up for what the winter had taken. The creek ran high and cold with snowmelt. The meadows went green with a speed that seemed impossible after months of white, and the light stayed long into the evening, long enough that you could work outside past 7 and still see clearly. They broke ground on the schoolhouse in June. It was Silas and Ben Marsh and Tom Henderson, and both Pittman brothers, and a man named Garvey, who'd come in with one of the April wagons and turned out to be a decent carpenter. They worked on it through the long June evenings and the July mornings before the heat came up, and Abigail watched it go from a cleared patch of ground to a frame to something with walls and a roof and a door that hung true on its hinges. She walked through it the day it was finished, alone, the smell of new lumber still sharp in the air, the afternoon light coming through the windows she'd specified, east-facing, for morning light, which was when children learned best. She walked to the front of the empty room and turned and looked at the rows of benches, rough cut but solid, and thought about fall. About the children who were currently running wild in the summer valley and would come in here when the weather turned and find a place that was built for them specifically, that existed because someone had thought they were worth the building. She thought about Missouri, about the schoolroom she'd left, about being 20 years old and told where to go and who to be. She had come here furious and frightened and had spent a winter discovering that fury and fear, sustained and undirected, were the loneliest way to live. That the walls you built to protect yourself eventually became the thing trapping you, if you weren't careful. That choosing to trust, not blindly, not stupidly, but with your eyes open and your own judgment intact, was not the same as surrendering. She had been so afraid that accepting any of this, the valley, the arrangement, the man, meant accepting that she had no say in her own life. She had not understood that saying yes to something, freely and with full knowledge, was exactly the definition of having a say. Nobody had taught her the difference. She had had to live her way into it. That was, she supposed, how most of the important things worked. Fletcher Ames left Blackstone Hollow in August. He didn't make an announcement. He simply began selling off his inventory at the trading post over the course of 3 weeks, efficiently and without drama. And then one morning his building was closed and locked, and he was gone, presumably to somewhere that didn't yet know the shape of how he operated. Abigail heard about it from Ruth, who told her with the expression of a woman who was neither surprised nor particularly satisfied, just noting the information. "Will he do the same thing somewhere else?" Abigail asked. "Probably," Ruth said. "Men like that don't change. They relocate." Abigail thought about that, about the specific frustration of watching something bad fail in one place and knowing it would reconstitute elsewhere, patient and adaptable. It was the kind of thing that could make you cynical if you let it. If you decided that because bad things persisted, the work of stopping them locally didn't matter. She decided it mattered. The valley was not a different place because Fletcher Ames had been prevented from stripping it. But the people in it were different. They knew each other's situations now. They'd sat at Ruth's back table together and compared notes and found collective ground, and that knowledge didn't evaporate when the immediate threat did. It stayed. It changed how they moved through the valley, how they talked to each other, what they were willing to ask for and offer. That was the thing about communities she was learning. They didn't get built in the good times. They got built in the February, at the back table, when everyone was scared and nobody wanted to be the first to admit it. In September, just before the fall came back and the school year started in earnest, Abigail discovered she was pregnant. She told Silas on a Tuesday evening, simply, across the table that had been the site of most of the important things that had happened between them. She told him and watched his face, which went through several things in quick succession. Something close to shock, then something that was not shock at all, but rather an emotion so large he seemed to need a moment to find his edges around it. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds. His hands were flat on the table, and then they weren't. He reached across, the same way he had in February, and covered her hands with both of his. "Okay," he said. His voice was different, quieter, something stripped out of it that was usually there. The careful restraint, the management, just his voice. "Okay." "You're going to be a father," she said, because she wanted him to hear the actual words. He looked at her with everything. Then, not one thread of it held back. "I know," he said. "I heard you." She laughed a little, her eyes stinging in a way she didn't try to stop. "You're supposed to say something. I'm trying to find the right thing. Just say what you actually think." He looked at her hands in his. "I think—" He stopped. started again. I came to this valley because I needed somewhere to be that didn't ask too much from me, he said slowly. I thought that was what I wanted. Quiet. My own work. Nobody to answer to. He looked up at her. I didn't know what I didn't know. What didn't you know? That being asked things by the right person isn't a burden. His thumbs moved across her knuckles. That having someone to answer to, the right someone, is the thing that makes the work mean something. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, in the cabin that had become their home through winter, and argument and accumulated daily choice. The man she hadn't asked for, who had turned out to be exactly what she would have asked for if anyone had thought to consult her. That's the right thing, she said. He nodded once, which was Silas for everything. The second winter came as the first one had, with intention, with the mountains making it clear that ease was not on offer. The first snow fell on the 1st of November, which even Silas acknowledged was earlier than he'd expected. But the woodpile was enormous. The root cellar was full. The schoolhouse had held its first 2 months of classes, and Clara Marsh was reading things that most adults in the valley couldn't. And Ned Pittman's father had come to Abigail one afternoon with his hat in his hands and said, carefully, that he'd seen the drawings she'd kept, that he hadn't known, that he didn't know what to do with the information, but he'd been thinking about it, and she'd told him that was a good start. Edmund's health had steadied. He was not well in any permanent sense, but he was stable in the way of a man who had found a rhythm he could sustain, and Silas went by twice a week without being asked, and Edmund had stopped pretending he didn't need him to. The valley had changed, not dramatically, not in ways that would show up in any record anyone kept, but in the way of a community that had been tested and had come through it knowing more about itself than it had before. People left doors open in a way they hadn't. Debts were discussed rather than hidden. On Saturdays at Ruth's store, the back table wasn't where you went for crisis management. It was just where people sat sometimes, because sitting together had become a habit worth keeping. On the first really cold night of November, with the snow already a foot deep and the wind doing its familiar work against the cabin walls, Abigail sat by the stove with her hands on her middle. The child was making itself known now, insistent, real, and watched Silas bank the fire for the night. He went about it the way he went about everything, methodically, unhurried. The attention he gave a task the same whether it was significant or routine. She had spent a year watching this and had never stopped finding it settling. The quality of steadiness in him, the absence of drama, the simple, dependable fact of who he was. She thought about October, about the woman who'd arrived in this valley with a trunk and a wall and a determination to survive without owing anything to anyone. That woman had not been wrong, exactly, about the need for self-preservation. She had been wrong about the shape of it, had confused independence with isolation, had thought that needing nothing from anyone was the same as being strong. It wasn't. She knew that now with the certainty of lived knowledge rather than borrowed opinion. Strength was not the absence of need. Strength was choosing carefully who you let matter to you and then letting them matter fully and not taking it back when it got frightening. Strength was sitting at a table in February with frightened people and finding the common ground. Strength was a man who built exits into arrangements because he thought freedom was more important than getting what he wanted. And strength was a woman who had been handed a life she didn't choose and had looked at it hard with clear eyes and found that underneath the circumstances she hadn't chosen were people worth choosing and had chosen them anyway, with her full self, holding nothing back. That was not what she'd expected to find in Blackstone Hollow. She hadn't expected to find anything except endurance. She had found instead the particular discovery that waited at the end of every winter worth surviving, that the place you were forced to stand could become, if you stayed long enough and looked honestly enough, the place you would choose to stand. She hadn't chosen this valley. She had chosen everyone in it, and they had chosen her. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those small daily choices, the distinction had dissolved. Silas finished with the stove and turned to find her watching him, which she did not try to hide. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Come sit down." He came and sat beside her, and the fire settled in the stove, and the snow went on outside, and the mountains held the valley in their cold, steady hands the way they always had and always would. Their child would be born in this valley, would learn to read in the schoolhouse Silas had built with his neighbors, would grow up knowing the creek and the tree line and the shape of the mountains in every season, would be, before any other thing, a person of this place, which was imperfect and isolated and cold 6 months of the year, and full, Abigail knew now, of everything that actually mattered. She leaned her shoulder against Silas's arm. He didn't say anything. He put his arm around her, and she felt the solid warmth of him, and the child moved, as if registering it, and outside the winter deepened, and the stars came out over the mountains, and the valley lay quiet under its cover of snow, small and real, difficult and lasting. The loneliness was gone. It had not been driven out by happiness or luck or any particular stroke of fortune. It had been replaced, gradually and without ceremony, by the thing it had always been the absence of, the ordinary, imperfect, absolutely necessary weight of a life shared with people who knew you and stayed anyway. That was what Blackstone Hollow had given her. That was what she had finally let herself receive.